This is the world's smallest, cheapest, and lightest 8 to 16 millimeter ultra wide angle zoom lens for modern mirrorless cameras. And this is important because there's only one other 8 to 16 millimeter mirrorless lens on the market right now. And that's made by Fujifilm. It only works on Fujifilm cameras. It costs 3 times as much and it weighs twice as much. So for a lot of people that want an 8 to 16 millimeter lens, this is actually the only choice that you've got right now. Now, full disclosure, this lens was sent out to me at no cost to myself for the purpose of making this video, but this is not a paid or sponsored video, and the company had no say in the making of the video. The other thing we should discuss when we're talking about the focal range of this lens, this 8 to 16 millimeters, this is really the headline feature of this lens. And that's because there's other lenses out there that start at 10 and go to 18, or 10 and go to 22 or 24, but this is really one of the only lenses out there that starts at 8 millimeters. And this is really important because 8 millimeters is actually significantly wider than 10 millimeters. And when we look at a situation where you need 8 millimeters, be that in landscape or be that in architecture or in a historic city, a lot of the time you're not going to have the ability to have that 10 millimeter lens and back up. You're often restricted to the position that you have in a landscape or a city or historic building or real estate or architecture, where that 8 millimeters just gives you that little bit of extra versatility to get that much wider field of view. But on the other end of the spectrum, if we're comparing the 16 millimeter, the long end of this lens, to say sort of a 20 millimeter, an 18 millimeter on another wide angle zoom lens, because we have mirrorless cameras that have so many megapixels now, and we've got very good resolving power in this lens, that's just a matter of cropping in. So if you've got an 8 to 16 millimeter lens and you need a little bit of extra reach on the long end, you can always crop in. If you're on a 10 to 18 or 10 to 24 or 10 to 20 millimeter lens and you need that extra wide field of view and you can't back up, well, there's really nothing you can do about that. So when you're looking at lenses and looking at focal ranges, you almost always want to err on the side of having a lens that's a little bit wider rather than a lens that's got a little bit more reach. And this lens has really been designed to be an ultra portable, affordable, architecture, landscape, real estate, travel, adventure type lens. Now, the first thing I see this lens great for is landscape photography. And the 8 to 16 millimeters is a super versatile focal range for landscape. And to start with, at 8 millimeters, you've got that really wide wraparound field of view. This is going to be great whether you're sort of in a forest or if you're sort of up against a cliff face and you're trying to get that in front of you, or so if you're looking down a cliffside. If you've got sort of clouds going overhead, you want to do a time lapse, or you've got the stars, even sort of the stars at night. I got a few shots with this where I didn't even know the stars were going to be in the photo, but they were in the photo. So you do have a number of options in landscape, and 8 millimeters is probably too wide in a lot of situations for landscape. But zooming into 16 millimeters, now we're at 24 millimeters in a sort of full frame field of view. This is a standard wide angle lens. This is super common and extremely popular for landscape photography. So starting at 8 millimeters and going all the way up to that 16 millimeters, we've got an extremely versatile focal range for landscape. The other thing I'd say about this lens is sort of one of the disadvantages of it over something like the Fujifilm 8 to 16 f2.8 is the fact that it's a lens that starts at f3.5 and goes to f5, where that Fujifilm lens is an f2.8 lens. But when we are shooting landscape, generally speaking, we want a very deep depth of field. We want everything in focus. We're not trying to get sort of the thing in front of us in focus and the thing off in the background being blurry. With landscape, we're trying to tell a complete story, so we're trying to kind of get everything in focus. And the fact that this only starts at f3.5 and goes to f5 really isn't a problem for landscape, given most of the time you're going to be shooting this at around f8, f11, somewhere in that range. So an excellent portable landscape lens. The only disadvantage I'd see with this lens about landscape is it does not appear to be a weather sealed lens. At least it doesn't say anything on the box about it being weather sealed. So at this stage, I'm assuming that it is not a weather sealed lens. The next thing that I see this as an obvious candidate for is architecture, interior, and real estate. Going to 8 millimeters is going to give you an incredibly wide field of view. But once again, going to 16 millimeters, which is a 24 millimeter equivalent on full frame, is going to give you a standard wide angle lens. And I would say just about every real estate photograph that you've seen where you've got that really wide view of the room and it's all the details, and they probably shot it in a way that the inside and the outside are all exposed properly. those are almost always shot somewhere between this range of 8 to 16 millimeters. So if you're shooting interiors, if you're shooting real estate, you're traveling through historic buildings, cities, churches, this really is going to cover you for all of those purposes. And going to that, once again, looking at that, going to that 8 millimeters, we are just going to get that extra bit of wraparound image, particularly for these historic buildings, whether it be churches, museums, art galleries. I spent a bit of time walking around Melbourne with this lens, got some great shots in the St. Paul's Cathedral, in some of the art galleries around Melbourne, Australia, and it really, really suits those environments well. And this is the widest angle lens that I've got for APS-C sensor cameras, so that makes it my absolute go-to lens right now for that kind of interior photos, inside churches, historic buildings, what have you. The other place I see this lens being extremely useful for is environmental portrait and a certain style of street photography. Now, starting with environmental portrait, I think the 16 millimeter focal length on this lens is extremely useful. And it matches up with the Sigma 16 millimeter, which is one of the most popular APS-C sensor lenses that you can buy right now. In fact, that's the lens that I shoot all of my videos on. You're looking at me on the 16 millimeter now. So this is a very standard focal length, a very popular 24 millimeter full frame equivalent. And I think for environmental portrait, where you get a picture of somebody and it shows the environment around them, I think this is actually a very good focal length for that. Now, the other one I'm going to say is looking at a certain style of street photography. And this is the style of street photography where you're trying to capture a photo of a person in the built environment, the structure of a city, but there's one little person in the scene and then you've got this whole wraparound environment around them. It's kind of this striking, lonely figure style of street photography. And you could shoot that style of street photography with this lens, shooting it anywhere between 8 and 16 millimeters. And I've shot it at both 8 and 16 millimeters. In fact, I'll throw a couple images on screen now. This was a girl and she was sitting on her own. And I was able to capture this image where it was just her in this big built environment. And I shot one at 8 and one at 16. So you can see there's two different looks there. And I think the 16 millimeter probably works a bit better. 16 millimeters is still quite a wide field of view. But I think for that sort of lonely figure style of street photography, I think this is an excellent lens for that purpose. I should also mention that with ultra wide angle lenses like this one, you are capturing a huge amount of the environment around you, which means you are going to get some very, very bright parts of your scene and you're going to get some very, very dark parts of your scene. This often makes it hard to nail exposure and get the brightest parts exposed properly and the darkest parts exposed properly. And in most situations, it's nearly impossible. And because of that, I'm often either shooting an HDR photo, a series of photos, and sort of putting them together in Photoshop, what have you. Or the other thing I like to do, and this is really my preference, is to shoot the photo and then convert it to a black and white photo. And then you get this really cool contrast. And I think a lot of the samples I probably showed in this video, I've shown in black and white because I think this lens works really, really well as a black and white lens. And it really, the optics and the coatings and everything really give you a nice contrast. So I think this is a fantastic, just general purpose black and white lens. Looking at the lens itself, this is a manual focus, manual aperture lens, and it's a zoom lens. So obviously it's got manually zooming as well. It's one of the nicest built lenses that you are going to find, and pretty much all of the Laowa lenses that I've ever used are built like this. They are built about as well as you can build a lens. You've got an all-metal body, you've got a metal lens mount, all the rings are metal. It really does have an incredibly nice feel. It has one of the most satisfying lens caps I've ever used. And I'll just show you how this works, if I can find the little red dot. So you take that red dot, and on the lens cap, you line up this red dot, and then you click it in place. And I can't tell you how, how nice and satisfying that is. It's so good. Anyways, that's the lens cap. Now, a common problem with lenses like this, where you have quite a bulbous front element, is the inability to use a filter. They have come up with something very clever. There's a couple ways that manufacturers generally deal with this. They either have this huge tulip-style design where it comes away from the lens to create an area that you can put a lens filter on. And you'll see this on the, I think it's the Rokinon 12 millimeter, Samyang Rokinon, same lens, 12 millimeter, has that tulip style design to put that filter on. If they did that with this lens, it actually makes the lens bigger, which you see with that Rokinon one. But they have come up with this system where rather than having a permanently attached tulip style section of the lens to put that filter on. They've just had this. This goes on where that lens cap would go on. So this is an 86 millimeter thread, I think it is. And I think it's a really clever thing, and it means that you can use filters with this and I don't think any of the 8 to 16 millimeters that have ever been made, even the old ones before mirrorless lenses, could use a filter. So I think that's pretty cool. The other thing is the size of this lens, which is a real headline feature, particularly when we compare it to the Fuji lens. Here is the Sigma 18 to 50, which is widely considered one of the most amazing engineering marvels, tiny little do-it-all zoom lens for APS-C sensor cameras. And you can see that they're almost identical in size. That just gives you an idea of how small they've been able to make this incredible zoom lens. So I think that is probably one of the biggest selling features of it, is the fact that it's so small. Now, looking at the mounts that this comes on, this is pretty cool because you're going to be able to get this on every popular mirrorless mount. It's got Sony E mount, Fuji X mount, Nikon Z mount, Canon R, and Canon EF. So the Canon R mounts are very hard to find nowadays. They're releasing it on an RF mount, which is great. But in addition to that, they're also releasing it on EFM. So I was super surprised by that. And for current pricing and availability, as well as all those different lens mounts, I will put some links in the description down below. When we look at the optical performance of the lens, the first thing I want to have a look at is distortion. And this is an interesting one. And what you have to know with manual lenses like this, the manufacturers are put under a lot more pressure than somebody who has got an autofocus lens that has electronic contacts, because a lens like this can actually tell the camera how to correct if there is distortion in the lens. And what you will find with these new Sigma lenses, these new small Sigma lenses, there often is a lot of distortion that is being corrected in camera with the profiles. Where if you've got an all manual focus, manual aperture lens, there's no way to send that information through to the camera. That means that the optical design is a lot harder to get a lens that looks great out of camera. And they've done a pretty good job with this one. The only thing I will say is what distortion is there is slightly wavy, so it would be complicated to correct manually. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a profile for this in Lightroom, so it'll be one click and you'll correct it. And in most situations where I'm using this, I don't notice it. But if I do have straight lines close to the edge of screen, I will notice this slight wavy distortion, which is just something to be aware of. It's also something that if you are shooting video, you probably won't be able to correct it. In all the video footage I've shot so far, nothing has stood out to me, but it is there and it isn't automatically corrected by the camera. The next thing I want to look at is vignette, and this lens does have a reasonably heavy vignette, certainly not the worst that I've ever seen, and it will be a one-click correct in Lightroom once the profile's out for it, but it does have a bit of a heavy vignette, and you're also going to notice it in video. It does improve as you stop it down a bit, but vignette is a feature of this lens, and in general, it's a feature of most of these ultra-wide angle zoom lenses like this. When I look at the chromatic aberration in this lens, it is very well controlled. You will notice some slight purple outlining on very high contrast scenes, generally when you have a very dark piece of something and you have backlit by the sun, but it really is quite well controlled in the scheme of things. And I don't see any chromatic aberration in any of the normal situations where I'm not actually trying to find chromatic aberration. So I think in normal use, you are not going to notice it. It's towards the better end of lenses with controlling chromatic aberration and longitudinal chromatic aberration, but there is a little bit of it present. Looking at the flare resistance on the lens, this is where it's interesting. It's a bit of a mixed bag. There are times you look at that big bulbous front element. That is a lot of glass that is there to catch the light. And what I found is in situations where I thought it might flare, where there was actually a light kind of indirectly in the frame coming straight at the lens, it actually held and controlled the lens flare extremely well, like surprisingly well, in a way that I didn't think it would. But then when you had a light coming from the side at certain angles, it would kind of flare worse than I expected. So I'd say the flare performance was a bit of a mixed bag. There were situations where the stray light was coming from the side and giving a bit of flare. I was able to just hold my hand up and just shade the lens, and it was absolutely fine. So I think it is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to flare. The performance is good, but if you've got some really hard angle light coming from the side, you will sometimes get a bit of flare and a bit of desaturation in the image. Looking at close-up image quality, it's surprisingly good on this lens. I didn't expect it to be as good as it is now. It's a super wide-angle lens, so you're not getting a max, like a huge amount of magnification. But I did take some flower shots, some different shots, and there was plenty of detail in those shots, nowhere near macro levels or anything like that, but certainly very good detail, and you can take close-up shots with this lens, and it does perform pretty well in close-up image quality. Looking at the sharpness of the lens, this is often a very hard one to evaluate when you're looking at wide-angle lenses, and that's because in general, these ultra-wide-angle lenses, they push everything so far away that when you take a photo, you tend to actually zoom in more on the image to try to find the detail than you do with a lens that isn't quite as wide. And I did find myself doing that. I'd zoom in, and then I'm like, oh, well, maybe this wasn't as sharp as I thought. And then I realized that I've zoomed in past the pixel level. So I think once I kind of worked that out, and I even wanted to make sure I was completely sure of myself, I brought in the Fujifilm 10 to 24 millimeter, and I did a comparison between those lenses because that is a 10 to 24 millimeter f4 lens. It's actually a very highly regarded lens. It's a very sharp lens. And what I found is the image quality between this lens and that Fujifilm 10 to 24 millimeter, keeping in mind 10 to 24 millimeters is nowhere near as hard a focal length to design a 10 to 24 f4 than it is to design an 8 to 16 f3.5 to f5. And it performed about on par. I would say at times maybe the Laowa lens was a tiny bit lower contrast, but I think the details were pretty well the same. And finally, looking at bokeh, there isn't a lot of bokeh to see here. It's pretty hard to get bokeh because when we started f3.5 and 8 millimeters, it's very hard to get an out of focus background or area, and it's really not what this lens is designed for anyways. But when you do, I think the background blur is acceptably good, and in many ways, it's probably not all that relevant, but when you do get a bit of blurry background, I think it's fine and it's not distracting. So ultimately, I have to ask, who is this lens for? Well, I think to start with, it's for somebody that sees the value in that extra 8 and 9 millimeters leading up to the 10 millimeters. If you're somebody that only needs that 10 millimeters, you don't need that extra wide for landscape, you don't need that extra wide for historic cities or churches, you don't need that extra wide for architecture or real estate, then I think you might as well start with the 10 millimeter lens, and I'd probably look at one of the modern autofocus 10 millimeter to 20 or 10 to 18 millimeter lenses out there. But if you are somebody who's going to use that extra wide and you are shooting those landscapes or interiors or architectures or historic buildings where that 8 millimeters is actually going to make a huge difference, then I think this lens represents reasonable value, and I think you'll be very happy with the image quality because I think it is on par with most of the first-party lenses out there. For pricing and availability, I will put some links in the description down below, and if you're interested in what the images look like out of the widest angle full-frame lens ever made, I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is Laowa's 9mm f5.6 rectilinear full-frame lens, and it just takes some absolutely crazy images. If you haven't seen images out of that lens, I suggest you check out this video.